Thank you everyone for coming. This is a great opportunity to be here to introduce my work. So let me start with the motivation. Nowadays, millions of people migrate from less developed areas to more developed ones. Why do they migrate? For better income, public services, or amenities. Marriage prospects are also important, but largely overlooked. By marriage prospects, I mean the gains from finding spouses with higher income or other desirable characteristics, such as being locals. Migrants may want to find local spouses because it helps them to overcome the policy restrictions. What are these policy restrictions? I refer to the large barriers migrants face in order to access certain benefits. It could be the green card restriction in the US or migrants' access to the permanent residency. It could also be the Hukou restrictions in China, which restrict migrants' access to the local public services, even if migrants migrate within China. There is evidence in both the US and EU showing that migrants will adjust their intermarriage choices in response to migration regulations. This raises an important question. What is the impact of migration policies on migrant flows if we take into account this intermarriage response? To help you better understand the concepts, let me first introduce the conceptual framework that I consider in my paper. Individuals will make their migration decisions based on the expected migration returns. The migration policy here is captured by the probability K that a migrant can obtain local status by themselves. Having this local status allows migrants to have access to local benefits fee in addition to wage, marriage prospects, and maybe some other components such as amenity. Migrants can also have partial access to these local benefits if they don't have local status, but having local spouses. So this B is greater than 0 and smaller than 1. What my paper trying to argue is that the change of migration policies K will not only affect migration decisions through the direct access to this local benefits fee, but also through the change of marriage prospects. The marriage prospects are the additional gains that migrants can obtain from the marriage market. It will depend on the probability that a migrant can marry with different types of locals or other migrants. And it will also depend on the corresponding utility migrants can obtain in these different marriages. So to understand this impact, let's imagine a scenario. If the local government want to attract high-skilled migrants and increase this probability K only for the high-skilled migrants, we can expect that these high-skilled migrants will depend less on the marriage with locals and may prefer to marry other migrant spouses. This is a substitution effect, which mainly affects the targeted migrants who are directly affected by these policies. But this is not the end of story, because these migration policies also change the composition of the marriage market. We can imagine that if K increases only for high-skilled migrants, there will be more high-skilled migrants and more individuals with local status as the destinations. So the migration of low-skilled migrants may increase as well, because they would have more chances of accessing these local benefits through marriage. So particularly, it means that the marriage prospects for these low-skilled migrants without local status will increase. Then, in this paper, I mainly studied two questions. Given that migration decisions is affected by multiple factors, how important are marriage prospects in migration decisions? I first quantified the effect of intermarriage opportunities. I show that it drives 10% of the migration of young people to the large cities in China. And second, I want to understand how this intermarriage response shapes the impact of migration policy on migrant flows. To do that, I will change the migration policy and study the migrant flows if I allow individuals to adjust their spouse choices, or if individuals cannot or individuals follow their original marriage patterns. So to study these questions, I embed marriage matching in a migration model. I first illustrate the policy impacts through marriage using a simple theoretical model, and then structurally estimate a more sophisticated dynamic migration and marriage model using data about migration within China. To estimate this model, I will rely on the range policy variations, which will affect the probability K and the ratio B in the conceptual framework. So to give you a better idea of the context in China, let me introduce the Hukou system in China. This system registers individuals to a specific city, town, or rural area to control migration. In the planned economy, the rural population work on agriculture and provide agricultural products for the urban population. The migration was highly restricted. So for these individuals, if they migrate from rural area, for example, to cities such as Shanghai, it will be considered as illegal migration. Then to promote economic development, the migrants are later able to find jobs in the cities, but they could still have little access to these large urban benefits, including the cheaper housing, public education, advantages in job search, etc. And this system was rigid to maintain the welfare of the urban residents. And it was also a major cause of mobility constraint and labor misallocation in China. To give you a better idea of how this system works. So the local government will set the criteria on the migrants' eligibility for this local hukou. Part of these criteria are merit-based. It affects the probability, it determines the probability or the chance that a migrant can obtain local hukou by themselves. It depends on the employment, investment, house purchase, and talent programs. And a part of this criterion are spouse-based. It depends on the length of marriage and age if migrants have local spouses. So if we refer to the conceptual framework, it is correlated with parameter B. So in this sense, these Hukou restrictions are similar to the immigration restrictions, because in both cases, migrants need restricted permits in order to access certain benefits, either by themselves or through marriage. So the insights of my paper are not only specific to China, but can also be applied to the other contexts. Now let me provide the overview of the main results. So in the theory part, I show that an increase in the probability K for the high-skilled migrants will also encourage the migration of low-skilled migrants. And then in some cases, it may even reduce the average skill level of migrants. Then in the empirical analysis, with data in China, I focus on the number of young migrants in the large cities for the year 2000. I first show that this intermarriage opportunities matters, and it will increase the migration of women by 15% and of men by 6%. 1/3 of this increase is due to these benefits that the migrants can obtain by marrying locals. And in the second, I also conduct other types of counterfactual exercises, which is to study the counterfactual policies of giving migrants local hukou right after migration. I show that the migrant flows will increase by about 2 times. However, if we neglect this policy impact through marriage prospects, we would underestimate the migration of men by 30% and of women by 40%. We may also mispredict the characteristics of migrants. Specifically, we would overestimate the inflow of highly educated migrants. So this paper mainly contributes to 2 strands of literature. The first literature is about migration response to migration policies, or you can understand it as the impact of migration policies on migrant flows. One of my contributions is that I introduce this policy impact through the endogenous marriage responses. And the insights are not only relevant for China, but can also be applied to the internal migration in other developing countries or the immigration, or the immigration in the developed countries such as. Then this paper also contributes to the literature that studies the migration driven by marriage motives. I quantify the effect of intermarriage on migrant flows. So the intermarriage in my case would refer to the marriage between individuals with this local status and the individuals without local status. And I also decompose the effect of the channels proposed by the literature. Now let me, if you don't have questions, let me come to the details of this paper. So in the following talk, I will first talk about the Hukou reforms that I will use, and then talk about structural model that I will use to estimate this model. I will talk about structural model and then come to the counterfactuals that I use to answer my research questions. So this is so in the Hukou, there were large-scale reforms, the Hukou reforms since 1997, initiated by the central government to promote the economic development and to reduce the political tensions for the human rights. So the blue maps here shows the merit-based reform index across prefectures and over time. These index are collected by FAN 2019. So 3 means the most, 3 is the most lenient policies. It means that migrants can obtain this local hukou by contributing to the social security for less than 5 years. 0 is the most restrictive ones. It means that migrants can only obtain local status if they are public sector employees. I also collect these spouse-based reforms from these policy documents and characterize these policy restrictions following the similar spreads. So the green maps here shows the spouse-based reform index. The number 4 is also the most lenient ones. It means that there is no restrictions on the length of marriage and age. And 0 means that migrants may have to get married for more than 10 years and satisfying some additional age or quota restrictions. So this Hukou reform, yes?
Ling. So I was just wondering, when this migrant couple has a child, right? In these places where you have to be married for 10 years or more for both of them to be considered local, what happens to the child?
So the child is like before 1998, if the child will follow the Hukou status of their mother. So before 1998, it means if rural women marry an urban man, then the child will inherit this Hukou status from the mother, which means the child will have urban Hukou. And then after 1998, the children can choose between the Hukou status of the mother or the Hukou status of the father. So is that clear? So
yes, that's great. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Just another question quickly.
Yes.
So is it possible that for some province, it's more easy to get the Hukou by your employment rather than marrying?
I would say, I think it depends.
Yeah.
So if for high-skilled migrants, then if they can easily find the job and get a Hukou status by themselves, then they don't need to rely on the marriage, because if they rely on the marriage, they have to maybe get this Hukou status after 10 years.
Yeah, that's what I'm seeing from the colors of your 2 maps. Yeah.
Yes,
thank you.
Thank you. So these Hukou reforms accompany an increase in migration and intermarriage in China. So in the following graph, the x-axis is a year. The y-axis on the left-hand side is a percentage. So if the blue box here would be the percentage of individuals that migrate beyond their home prefectures. And the yellow dot here characterizes the percentage of locals who marry with individuals without local status. And the right-hand side is the average reform, the merit-based reform index. I didn't plot the spouse-based reform index here, but it also follows a similar increasing trend. So what I will use this location, this migration and marriage responses to these Hukou policies to estimate the parameters of my structural model.
Sorry?
Yes?
How did you calculate these out-migration numbers? Because this 20% looks so big. So it's certainly different for international migration. So is it just the share of individuals living in a prefecture, which is not the same as the one they were born?
Yes. So a migrant would be someone who live in the place where how do you say, this place is different from their Hukou place. Yes. In China, the migration rate is quite high for the year 2010. I mean, after year 2010. So let me talk about this structural model. So let me start by motivating a bit like why I need a structural model, because migration choice and marriage choices are interactive choices. In order to quantify the effect of marriage prospects, I need a structural model. And a structural model would allow me to disentangle the policy impact through this marriage response. And a structural model would also allow me to account for the policy spillovers across regions, because migrants choose actually between multiple locations rather than between their home place and a specific destination. So if one region changes their policies, it will also affect the migration inflows of the other regions. Then why I need a dynamic model? That is because migration and marriage choices are dynamic choices in nature. And in reality, we observe a lot of individuals delay their marriage in order to find a better spouse in the future. So if we consider if we consider these individuals make permanent decisions, we would underestimate the utility of marriage. Then in the developing countries, we also observe a lot of temporary migration. And these individuals migrate to the cities, work for a short time, and bring money, and come back home because they have little access to these local public services as destinations. If we consider this temporary migration as permanent migration, we would underestimate this value, the value of these local benefits, which are crucial for the counterfactuals.
So
now let me, yes?
Yeah, just regarding marriage delays.
Yes.
Just that in China, there is no evidence of patrilocality or matrilocality right after marriage, because this kind of assumption cannot go well with contexts like sub-Saharan Africa, where you migrate at the same time as you married. You married and directly you change your residence, and it's totally correlated, the fact that you migrated.
Yes. So in that case, there would be, so I would say, but still, I think the answer would include two parts. So first, in the Africa, I think still people would delay their marriage in order to search for a better spouse. And the second part of this answer is, if this type of pattern happens, I know that in a lot of developing countries, people would only migrate if they already find a spouse, either through the agency or the other ways. Then in this case, in my model, it will be captured by the process that they still first migrate, but once they get married, they just marry with this specific, type of individuals.
In your case, it's not confounded at all.
Could you say it again?
In your case, marriage and migration are not confounded at all.
Okay. Okay, I see.
No, just that you can have the intention to migrate to find somebody, or to migrate and then find somebody in order to stay. I understand that, but you are not doing the both at the same way, in full correlated way. So that's what I understand from your context. context. Does
Yes,
that-
yes. So I consider that people first migrate and then find spouses, rather than first get married and then migrate.
Yeah.
Yes. But that would
Is it
be,
the-
yeah.
Sorry, does the same thing hold for jobs? I first have to move, and then wherever I move to, I can look for jobs, right? Or are there any
Yes.
agencies that make it easy for me to find a job in a different city?
I think so for example, from what I know is like 4% of this migration, for example, in some regions is organized by this government. Then if this is through the government agencies, then it is likely that they first find a job and then migrate to the destinations. So did I answer your questions?
Yeah, that's really interesting. It's just kind of, I guess, well, we'll see in your model how you model it, right? Because
Yes.
also thinking
I
about
would, yes. I would say this model is a simplification. So this model is an extension of the static to region model of Dubuis 2019. I assume individuals live for several periods. In each period, they first decide where to migrate. Once they migrate, they will choose whether and whom to get married. At the end of each period, they will have some probabilities of getting local hukou. So how individuals make location choices? I assume that individuals will choose between rural areas, small cities, big cities, and mega cities in 8 big regions in China. And their location-specific utility will depend on the predicted wage, the potential access to these hukou benefits depending on the policies, some marital gains, migration cost, and some idiosyncratic location preference. And once they make location decisions, how they make spouse choices. I assume that individuals will choose a spouse depends on their types. Their types would be a combination of age, the education level, and the hukou place of the spouse. Their marriage utility will depend on the spouse income, the benefits they can get from finding local spouses, and I also allow additional taste for similarity. It captures the pattern that individuals prefer to marry the other spouses with similar age, education levels, or the same home place. Then these within household transfers will be crucial to capture the bargaining power within the families. To understand these transfers, we can consider a special case. If most individuals want to find a spouse with higher income and local status, it is very likely that the demand for this type of spouse would be higher than the supply. So for these individuals, in order to marry their ideal spouses, they would have to transfer part of their utility to their spouses in order to attract them. So given these location choices, there will be a unique marriage matching equilibrium, which determines the unique household utility division for each type of couple. Then, in order to estimate this model, I will first use the variation in the hukou policies to estimate these individual probabilities of obtaining local hukou. Then, in the second step, I will use the observed location and marriage responses to these policy variations to estimate the utility parameters in this location and the spouse choices. So to give you some confidence of this model, the average local benefits for the year 2005 is equivalent to 22% of monthly income, which is very close to the approximated values provided by the previous literature. Then, so the data that I gonna use is first, in the first step, I gonna combine the migration history data from this small survey and the hukou reforms in China to estimate these individual probabilities. In the second step, I will use the marriage and migration patterns that are observed in this 2000 and 2005 population census, which is a repeated cross-sectional data. And then also to control the regional characteristics, I will use the information from the yearbooks.
Sorry, Ling.
Yes?
In your model, do you consider that migrants are fully aware of all the variants existing in all the prefectures, potential migration destinations?
So I would say I allow individuals to be fully aware of the opportunities. But then, because there exists a case that maybe individuals from a specific province, they will never observe any migrants migrating to another specific province. In this case, I will shut down. I will take this choice away from the choice set.
Okay.
Yes.
I also have a very brief question on what do you assume on the side of the locals for the marriage decision? Do they also have preference over the migrants? Do they maybe prefer migrants that have higher wages? Or they just, in your model, they just accept whoever wants to marry?
So in the marriage market, everyone is active participants. So in the marriage market, there will be locals, there will be all types of migrants, and they will match with each other until no one has an incentive to deviate. Their utility would also depend on the income of the spouse. And for example, whether, and the taste, for example, for similarity, the taste for the education of spouse, age of spouse, etc.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Yes, thank you. So where does this identification come from? To give you a brief idea, so the location response to these Hukou policies will help me to identify this difference in the Hukou benefits, which is a fee in the conceptual framework. So let's consider a specific example. Consider two regions. Region A is a small city and region B is a big city. If we observe that this region A has more relaxed policies, but we observe fewer migrants. So all these difference that cannot be explained by the wage, by the fixed amenity, and the other components will be attributed to the difference of the local benefits. And if, for example, the Hukou reforms advance more in this small city A, but we observe less increase in these migrants. So following the same spreads, all the components that cannot be explained by wage, the other components will be attributed to the difference of these local benefits. Then the marriage response to these Hukou policies will help me to identify the benefits from this intermarriage. So for example, consider two regions. If region A has larger local benefits and we also observe more intermarriage, then all the components that cannot be explained by wage or the other marriage preference will be attributed to these benefits of intermarriage. And similar for these spouse-based reforms. So let me come quickly to the counterfactual exercises. So with this estimating model, I conduct two types of counterfactual exercises to answer two research questions. The first question is the effect of intermarriage opportunities on migrant flows. And the second question is the policy impact on migrant flows through these marriage prospects. I will consider a specific counterfactual policy of granting migrants local Hukou right after migration. So how to quantify this effect of intermarriage opportunities? I will shut down intermarriage and compare the case where individuals can choose spouses freely versus the case where individuals only marry other individuals from the same Hukou place. And then to quantify this effect of privilege, I will shut down the benefits that migrants can obtain from intermarriage. So the following table here, this shows a decrease in the number of migrants that in the large cities for the year 2000. So here you can see that this is a column for the males, this is a column for the females. I also provide the effect for individuals with different levels of education. So you can observe that the marriage prospects are in general more important for females. This is aligned with the previous literature that this marriage migration is more relevant for females. But what is different from the previous literature is that I also show that this intermarriage also matters for males. And the channels here, I would attribute it. So I would attribute these intermarriage opportunities to a different channel. So what are these channels? So for males, even if it is difficult for them to marry local women, they could still benefit from intermarriage because, for example, for these highly educated men, they can have a high chance of obtaining this local status. They could wait for the realizations of obtaining local hukou, and then they could benefit from intermarriage by helping their migrant spouses to settle down. So this is why that we observe that these marriage prospects seem to be more important for men with higher level of education. Then I further want to quantify the effect of the local benefits. To do that, I shut down this privilege that migrants can obtain by marrying locals, but I still allow migrants to choose spouses freely. So we can see that this effect of privilege mainly accounts for around 1/3 of these marriage prospects. And the other 2/3 can be attributed to the fact that migrants migrate to the big cities. They can find the locals because the locals have higher level of education or the other characteristics. Then for the second counterfactuals, I study the counterfactual policies of granting migrants local hukou right after migration. So this, the following table here shows a percentage increase in the migration to the large cities after removing these hukou restrictions. I find these results particularly interesting. So these are columns for men and these are columns for women. These are the results if we allow individuals to adjust their marriage choices in response to the migration policies. And this here without marriage adjustment means that even if migration policies change, migrants will not adjust their spouses and bargaining power within the families. So what you can observe is that if we first compare the individuals with higher than college level of education, we can see that it seems that if we ignore this marriage adjustment, we would overestimate the number of highly educated migrants. So why this is the case? So my interpretation is that these high-skilled migrants have a high chance of obtaining this local status by themselves. And they are popular in the marriage market because they can help their migrant spouses to settle down or access these local benefits. If their spouses, if their potential spouses can obtain local status by themselves, the migration returns of these highly educated migrants might decrease. This is the opposite story. The story would be the opposite for the individuals with lower level of education. Before, in order to access these local benefits, they want to engage in the intermarriage, but they may need to sacrifice their bargaining power in the families. After this policy change, if they can get these local benefits by themselves, they can have more bargaining power in the families. They can look for better spouses, which are not necessarily locals. So neglecting these marriage prospects will underpredict the migrant inflows of these low educated migrants. So to summarize, I think, yes. So to summarize, in this paper, I mainly study two questions. I first show that these intermarriage opportunities is important for the migration decisions. It increases the migration of young men to the large cities by 10%. And second, so compared to the literature, I introduce these marriage responses to how the migration policies will affect migrant flows. I show that if we neglect these marriage responses, we would mispredict the number and the characteristics of migrants if there is a change of migration policies. To show that, I study the specific policy of free movement in China. I show that neglecting these marriage responses, we would underestimate the migrant flows by 35%. We may also overestimate the number of highly educated migrants. So this is the main introduction of this paper.
Great, thank you very much, Ling, for this nice presentation. So we are all open to your questions. So please go ahead with remarks and comments to help Ling with this job market paper. Pretty advanced at this stage.
Yes, I think I was at some point I speed up because I was concerned about running out of time.
We have a question from Ami de Chapeau Rouge. Maybe you can ask yourself if you would like. I will just give you the right to talk.
Yeah.
Hi. Have you access to the question, Ling?
Yes,
Yes.
it's a bit long.
Yeah, but I'm looking at the same time. If Ami de Chapeau Rouge want to ask it,
Yes,
I just give it the floor.
ignoring their pilot. Sorry, I got a bit confused because I think this person mentioned the policies not only after 2019, but also before 1998.
Okay. Okay, so let's come back to it later, maybe.
Yes.
So I will just begin with my own question.
Thank you.
Yeah, so do you think regarding your analysis that the Hukou system that is actually implemented, I don't know how it changed, how fair it is from the Hukou system in 2000 and 2005, but do you think that it's currently really encouraging intermarriage? That's your diagnostic at the end.
Sorry. So you were saying the policy thing?
Yeah, so sorry, if I try to resume my understanding of your analysis.
Yes.
That when you implement more restrictions on the mobility,
yes,
you increase the interest of people in intermarriages.
Yes. So yes. For the yes. So if the government make the general policies less lenient, then it will increase the incentives for migrants to engage in intermarriage. This is what we saw also in the US, because there is a paper written by Amadou Dolant and the other co-authors. They were showing that after the immigration enforcement in the US, they observed more intermarriage between the immigrants and the US citizens.
Okay, and we know this phenomenon in France too. And do you know if it's some marriages are like we called white marriages? Do you know if there is some following of marriages after the fact that a migrant married a local, and then you follow if they are staying together again after marriage, and if this person is really somebody in love with, and everything like that?
So in the case of China, I didn't study that. That is because in the around 2000 and 2005, the divorce rate in China is very, very low, which is not the case in France, I would say. I think in France, it would be easier, like for people to first get married, obtain French citizenship, and then get divorced, looking for better spouses. I think this is what you consider.
Yeah.
Yes. Maybe we can first go with the other questions, because I'm still not sure that I fully understand the questions of Ami.
Is it okay if I ask you about your identification strategy again?
Yes,
sorry to be that person, but if I remember correctly, right, so you're looking at kind of you're identifying the attractiveness of the local benefits by looking at, okay, let's look at the Hukou system, right, at the change there, and let's look at the corresponding change in immigration into that place. So I just wonder, I guess in your model, you don't allow for people, for the locals in certain cities to be more or less open to intermarriages. Because I could imagine that, you know, there is some, I mean, for China, a relatively small city that is actually, doesn't have a lot of migrants. And even if it does make its Hukou system more open to outsiders, I know that those locals don't really want to marry me because I'm not one of them. So, you know, even though the local benefits can be pretty valuable, I wouldn't move because that city-specific marriage prospects are pretty low. So I don't know if this is something you allow for in the model or it's not something that matters empirically.
I'm not fully sure that I understand your questions. So the way that I do allow individuals in different regions to have different preference for intermarriage, and so how I realize that. I mean, how I satisfy. So how to say? The way that I allow individuals to have in different regions to have different preference for intermarriage depends on how to say. It would first depends on how much that these migrants want to marry local spouses. If these migrants really want to marry local spouses, for example, in big cities, because there are a lot of local benefits, then it also implies that these locals will also gain a lot from this intermarriage, because the migrants will be willing to give send a lot of transfers to these locals. Then in small cities, if migrants are not so willing to engage in intermarriage, then the bargaining power, then the utility for these locals to engage in this intermarriage will be relatively low.
Yeah, that makes sense. So maybe I may have missed this, but can you measure the value of local benefits directly, or do you only back it out from the migration flows?
So I only back out from the migration flows.
Right. So I guess what I'm curious about is how can you separately identify, right? Like some city can be really attractive because it has amazing benefits, or maybe benefits aren't that great, but like people really want to marry me there, even though I'm not a local. So I'm just curious how we can separate those two, right? Like the willingness to intermarry and local benefits.
So yes, I don't allow the specific preference just for intermarriage in different regions. So I would assume that people have some disutility of marrying people from different regions. Sorry, I only capture two elements of intermarriage. One is this related to these local benefits, and another is a universal component, a universal disutility component that captures that people are unwilling to marry individuals from different regions. So in order to separate these two components, I will compare the marriage, for example, between migrants from different regions. How do you say? So the marriage between migrants and the other migrants from the same home place, and the marriage between migrants and the other migrants from different home place will allow me to identify this universal disutility from intermarriage. And then if I further compare the marriage between migrants and the locals, it will help me to identify this utility from intermarriage due to local benefits.
Good, I think that's much clearer now. Thank you.
Thank you.
I also have a question, since it's something that you mentioned briefly in the presentation, but you didn't get back to it in the result section. It was about return migration. So you showed that there is about 20% of Chinese people that migrate. But so
Yes.
is this a net rate, or this it includes the ones that then at some point they come back? And I was wondering whether changing this Hukou policy may also have an effect on return migration, so having less people going back to their own cities afterwards.
So the 20% in the graph is captured. I do not distinguish like a return migration or like the first migration. It is only the percentage of individuals who are in different prefectures than their Hukou place at the time of the interview.
Mm-hmm.
So but I do think like in China, if the Hukou policy really relax, then the return migration will definitely decrease, especially for the big cities. For small cities, not necessarily, because in China, like maybe people still enjoy lower living costs in the in the rural area. But then for the big cities, if they are able, for example, to stay in Shanghai or Beijing, I think these migrants will definitely be willing to stay there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that would be maybe a complementary analysis. Would be interesting to look at whether remittances change as well. So if they may not wish to go back at all, they may decrease also the amount of money that they're sending back home. So it may have an impact also on the sending regions.
Yes. So so a long time ago, I was thinking about this endogenous network formation. I think this would also affect the remittances, because if you no longer go back and you would send less money to people in your hometown. Yes, so I think, yes, thank you very much for your nice questions.
You're welcome, Ling Zhou. Maybe if you want to just come back to the remarks of Ami de Chapeau Rouge, I just think that maybe it's playing on the probability to get the Hukou access, because it's saying that some Hukou might be not delivered by the government. So maybe just play on the quantity of Hukou passport available for migrants to work and to have the same benefit as local. So you might just play on your probability to get it.
So yes, I think the case in China is like it is. So for the perspective of human rights, like the government should really allow like these migrants to have access to these local benefits, because they are so important. Especially, this creates a lot of problems. For example, for the left behind children, etc. So, but I don't really get the last sentence. So, marriage, partner choice, and preference. So the reason that I want to study this question, I want to study this counterfactual policy, is also because I think this is very important for the human rights. So it is important for us to understand what is going to happen, how it's going to affect the welfare of individuals in China if we allow this Hukou, if we remove these Hukou restrictions in the end.
Yeah, I think you made the right answers. Thank you, Ling.
Okay.
Yes, so yes.
If there are no more questions from the audience, maybe you can share your screen, so I'll just conclude.
Yes. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Ling, for this fascinating presentation, and thank you all for attending this seminar. Next week, we'll have Nikita Gabonyuk from the University of Luxembourg, who is going to talk about international migration unions. So if you want to have more information on our seminar, you're more than welcome to visit our website. And we're still reviewing submission for this semester. So if you wish to present, send us your paper at thejunioreconomic@gmail.com. And as you have realized by now, I guess we have this new feature where you can participate more actively to our seminar by joining as a panelist. And if you wish to join, you're just expected to read the paper in advance and to register to the seminar before Friday, the Friday prior to the next presentation. So thank you very much all for attending, and we hope to see you next week.
Thank you. Thank you very much.